I thought of these words by Sophia Ryan-Fahs, a great religious educator of the 20th century. Her works were those I grew up with, and so I think of them whenever I think of the task of religious instruction. She says, some beliefs are like walled gardens. They encourage exclusiveness and the feeling of being especially privileged. Other beliefs are expansive and lead the way into wider and deeper sympathies. Some beliefs are like shadows clouding children's days with fears and unknown calamities. Other beliefs are like sunshine blessing children with the warmth of happiness. Some beliefs are divisive, separating the saved from the unsaved, friends from enemies. Other beliefs are bonds in a world community where sincere differences beautify the pattern. Some beliefs are like blinders, shutting off the power to choose one's own direction. Other beliefs are like gateways, opening wide vistas for exploration. Some beliefs weaken a person's selfhood. They blight the growth of resourcefulness. Other beliefs nurture self-confidence and enrich the feeling of personal worth. Some beliefs are rigid, like the body of death, impotent in a changing world. Other beliefs are pliable, like the young sapling, ever growing with the upward thrust of life. We aspire to be a place that kindles such beliefs, not only in children, but in all of us, for at the end, we are all still children on a spiritual journey. And so we begin our hour of worship and invite our youngsters to serenade us with the promise of pliable young spirits.
Ready? This is my trunk. I'm a tall, tall tree. In the springtime, the blossoms grow on me. They open, they open. This is my trunk. I'm a tall, tall tree. In the summer, the breezes blow through me. I bend. This is my trunk. I'm a tall, tall tree. In the autumn, the apples grow on me. They drop, they drop. This is my trunk. I'm a tall, tall tree. In the winter, the snowflakes fall on me. Bird, bird. This is my trunk. I'm a tall, tall tree. In the springtime, the blossoms grow on me. They open, they open. Oh, Mr. Sun, Sun, Mr. Golden Sun, please shine down on me. Oh, Mr. Sun, Sun, Mr. Golden Sun, hiding behind the trees. These little children are asking you to please come out so we can play with you. Oh, Mr. Sun, Sun, Mr. Golden Sun, please shine down on me. Oh, Mr. Sun, Sun, Mr. Golden Sun, please shine down on me. Oh, Mr. Sun, Sun, Mr. Golden Sun, hiding behind the tree. These little children are asking you to please come out so we can play with you. Oh, Mr. Sun, Sun, Mr. Golden Sun, please shine down on, please shine down on, please shine down on me.
Would you join with me now as we share the responsive invocation, words of Kent Keith. People are illogical, unreasonable, and self-centered. Love them anyway. If you do good, people will accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Do good anyway. If you are successful, you will win false friends and true enemies. Succeed anyway. The good you do today will be forgotten tomorrow. Do good anyway. Honesty and frankness make you vulnerable. Be honest and frank. And the biggest people with the biggest ideas can be shot down by the smallest people with the smallest ideas. Being big anyway. People favor underdogs, but follow only top dogs. Fight for a few underdogs anyway. What you spend your years building may be destroyed overnight. Build anyway. People really need help, but may attack you if you do help them. Pretty sound advice, if you ask me. And difficult to follow, isn't it? Good morning. My name is Fred Wooden. I'm your preacher here at Fountain Street Church, one of two and a third clergy. When I mean a third, we have a wonderful gentleman in David Lee Smith who visits people who can't get to church, and my full-time colleague is Jason Hubbard, who attends to the chapel community and our social justice ministry. We have many other wonderful staffers, including our wonderful music director down here, and we have other people doing things all over the place, but it is all for you so that you can be equipped to do the ministry of your lives in a world that needs all the help it can get. I've already mentioned a few things that are going on today, but I want to lift up two things very quickly. There is a bake sale today. Are you hungry? You are now. And to remind you that next Sunday is an unusual, distinct, and worthwhile Sunday. Instead of two services, one in the chapel at 9:30 and one in the sanctuary at 11, we will be one community here at 10 a.m. because we are also going to hold in the midst of our worship service a brief meeting of the whole congregation till we can adopt some bylaw changes and hear a promising and exciting report on what's coming up in our 150th anniversary year. There will be music, there will be merriment, there will be fun, there will be good. You must be here at 10 a.m. next week. Be there or be square. All those things are going on this day. Fountain Street Church, if you don't already know it, is that place on the hill that everybody says you shouldn't go there, and yet they show up anyway. And for those people who don't come, there are those who watch us on TV, behind curtains. What we have discovered here at Fountain Street Church is that we are not just a community to ourselves, even for ourselves. We're a community for others. Almost everyone in Grand Rapids has been in this building at least once for some good reason. And almost everyone would say, if you ask them, well, if I didn't go to this church, I'd go to Fountain Street Church. Or if I went to any church, I would go to Fountain Street Church. We are the community for everyone. And you are part of that community and part of its ministry. And so if you're here for the first time, welcome home. If you've been here for the 500th time, welcome home. Because whoever is here, however you're here, however long you're here, you belong here. This is Fountain Street Church. And now, let us proceed with the beautiful music that awaits us. So, I'm thinking about my mom today. It's Mother's Day. She died in September of '04, just as I was about to be called by this church. So they're kind of blended together, that great forward moment for me and that great loss at the same time. And that's okay. It really is. What I want to let you know is I think about her every day, along with my dad. It's not a one-sided affection. And so when we come to Mother's Day, it's kind of odd because my parents are always with me, probably more in their passing than in their presence, because when they were there, I didn't have to think about them because they were there. Now they come to mind all the time and always in a cheerful and good way. There's a wonderful poem at memorial services that says, where we learn to forget the parts that aggravated us and we learn to keep the parts that please us. And that really does happen if you're fortunate. And I think that way about my mother-in-law, which is a much steeper climb, by the way. And I think about her a lot. And that's a question of temperaments. I'm not being critical. It's just, All relationships are complicated. What can I say? We have the same birthday, my mother-in-law and me. We were very similar in some respects. Maybe that's why. What has this to do with the offering? Well, there's a wonderful passage that comes out of the Hadith, the sayings of the prophet, those things attributed to the prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as they say, that a man came to him during his life and said, "My mother has died. What should I do in honor of my mother?" And the prophet thought for a moment and said, "Remember, this is in the desert. Go and dig a well, so that all who come may draw water from it. And therefore you can say, 'This I did in honor of my mother.'" And when you think about it, that is the perfect testimony of affection, the passing along, the paying forward. It occurs to me that biologically men are like 7/8 of a girl, of women, 7/8, because the Y is like an X with one piece missing. You see where I'm going? It's true. I read this, that the Y chromosome, all of us guys have one, is slowly getting smaller. It'll be a V chromosome in a few thousand years, and eventually it will vanish altogether, which doesn't mean there will not be males and females, just that all I'm saying, guys, is that we're playing with less than a full deck. Let me put it that way. Now, as if women didn't already know that, but that's another. But the deck that we have is all female when you think about it. That's the default state of our biology, to be female. We guys, we try to get there, but just can't quite. But I felt bad about that until I realized, hey, that means I'm 7/8 of a girl, and I'm still allowed to claim that. And I'm saying that when it comes to Mother's Day because there's this bizarre notion that somehow mothers are gentle and frail and need to be revered on the pedestal, you know the old. When in fact we're looking at ourselves, men. I'm talking to the boys now. We are looking at ourselves more than anything. I look like my dad, but I think like my mother. And that's a prize. That's a gift, which doesn't mean it's easy, but it's there. So I'm wondering how we can get beneath the hearts and flowers, the candy and cards thing. Because I'm not going to preach about Mother's Day. Because I've done it for 40 years and I'm kind of flat out of things to say. But it's still a significant moment. And it occurred to me we can do it here. Let's try. Oh, ancient, nameless, formless thing. Oh, the temerity of some to call you, it, their, them, God. But the moreness that is more than me and more than we and more than this and more than now and more than then. The moreness, the breathing, the being, whatever it you are. We swim inside this sea of being, of chromosomes and amino acids and things that make no sense, and yet when they find each other, they dance themselves into being, into life, into breathing and eating, into loving and caring. When we think of mothers, we think of those whose beings were vessels for more being, who wrapped themselves around the formation of new lives, who gave essentially their whole beings to new beings. That every one of us dwelt wrapped inside of this safety of another person. And in arriving may have actually threatened the life of the very one who gave us life. Oh, the majesty and mystery of it all. And yet how ordinary and daily. Just chemicals finding their way. We pause in reverence not only for mothers, but for the being that mothers represent. Call them goddesses, call them angels, call them whatever is wise and good. But in the end, we are gobsmacked by the miracle that existence is. And so we pause and let the mystery wrap around us as its own womb, as its own comfort and its own veil. We remember that we are tethered with ourselves not only to another person, but to a person behind that person and another and another and another, until virtually we are all ensnared. What we seek is a brief moment of remembering that deep down inside ourselves, so far that we can feel it curl within our innards itself, that each one of us is the seed and the fruit, the flower and the leaf, the egg and the animal. We are all mothers, fathers, children, brothers, sisters. We are all one. Is that not our prayer when all the words are taken away? And so we pause now in silence, which is where the prayer that matters most can be heard best. And so may it be. Yes, thank you very much, Marion Drake, for giving us the gift of your presence and your music this morning. I lift up now the names of those whose lives reached their conclusion in our midst in this year and in years past, asking that the blessing of their presence here over those years be a blessing to us now. For they have given us this place, and we are grateful for it. We lift up especially Margie Fuller and Buzz Cucci and Ann Logan and Vicki Hoffius, Mary Wilson and Lois Davis, Nancy Mueller, Don Crandall, George Loomis Sr., Russ Chandler, Stephen Peterson, Steve Moorhead, and Robert Wold. El Malay Rachamim, Shokim Rachamim, God filled with mercy, dwelling in the heavens' heights, bring proper rest beneath the wings of your Shekhinah, your presence, to the souls of our beloved and who have gone to their eternal place of rest. May you, who are a source of mercy, shelter them beneath your wings eternally. Bind their souls to you and to we, the living, that they may rest in peace, that we may be at peace. And let us say, Amen. Consider yourselves fortunate that I didn't give you a reading this morning, even though it was in the order of service. I'm talking about promises, and the best psalm for reading about promises is Psalm 119, all 176 verses of it. Longest chapter in the scripture, Jewish and Christian. It starts like this, though. You'll get a flavor. Happy are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of God. Happy are those who keep the decrees, who seek God with their whole heart, who do no wrong. It goes on like that for another 174 verses. Almost all of them saying, do what God says and you'll be okay. Don't, and things will really go south. You can read it on your own terms. Now, as I mentioned, I'm not going to preach about Mother's Day. I did do a little bit of thought on the matter. It has many origins, Anna Jarvis being the most notable. She was the one who lobbied Congress to create it, and after they created it, lobbied it to get rid of it. Why? Because she wanted it to be a sacred day when children would care about their mothers, send them a letter, attend to them, and instead the greeting card, flower, and candy industry came upon them like a flock of locusts, and she was horrified. But she was not the first. Julia Ward Howe, who was the great writer of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, was so horrified by the Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War that she created what she called the Mother's Day for Peace and wrote a proclamation about it and gathered women from around the country. The proclamation is printed in your hymn book. It is a mighty political, moral statement, which is why we don't do it, because we'd rather buy candy and flowers. But I also ran into other women who tried to get this started. A little bit like Memorial Day, a lot of people had the idea, and the one I want to lift up just for a second is Juliet Calhoun Blakely. Why? She was a temperance activist, and temperance was a very big deal among women suffragists and others because drunken husbands were a big deal. Why mention her? She started a Mother's Day of her own. Why tell you that? Because she did it in Albion, Michigan for about 2 or 3 years, and then it didn't quite catch. So Michigan is also the home of Mother's Day. Consider yourself preached to about Mother's Day. But speaking again of my mother, now I'll tell you the story I want to start with. She was not at all pleased when at 11 years old I said I want to be a Boy Scout. Mom had successfully kept me from joining the Cub Scouts with their blue uniforms and their popsicle stick projects. Oh, though, those boys in my class and their blue uniforms sure look snappy to me. So at 11, I was still determined to join, and she and Dad, they hesitated. They looked askance at the Norman Rockwellism of the Boy Scouts, a kind of world they tried to escape in their youth. My mom and dad, they were urbane. They were sophisticated. They loved jazz and cocktails and Mort Saul and Lenny Bruce, and I wanted everything other than that. But I insisted, and they relented, and so began 6 vivid years that ended in disappointment, but began with all the hope and zeal of someone newly baptized. My khaki uniform was still stiff and fresh by the time I had read straight through the entire Boy Scout handbook, memorized half of it. It was my Bible, and I inhaled its promise of a path upward to manhood along the Eagle Trail. Thus it was with genuine solemnity that I was inducted on my first Friday night by raising my right hand and repeating with the confidence of one who believes thoroughly, on my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country, to obey the Scout law, to help other people at all times, to keep myself physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight. 50 years later, that is still in my head, and happily. A recurring theme in the Hebrew Scriptures, which includes the book of Psalms, is the importance of keeping promises. The decisive moment in the Torah, for example, is that moment when Israel arrives at the foot of Mount Sinai, when they encounter the mighty, holy God who is going to give them the covenant, the law that they will follow and through which they and God will travel through history together. The story says that God was so close by that it involved much smoke and fire and thunder and earthquakes, so much that afterward the people begged Moses never to let God come so close again. But within weeks, if not days, they were already breaking the promise. Remember that it was Aaron who made the golden calf while Moses was up on the mountain. Remember that they also decided to say, well, this Moses fellow, he isn't doing very much for you. For us, let's go back to Egypt. They rebelled, they complained, they did everything but obey their promises, and what was the result? Illness, earthquakes, pestilence, all sorts of dread, including a punishment that everyone except 3 people had to die before they could cross the Jordan into the promised land. So important is honoring this covenant that it becomes the one continuous theme throughout Torah and the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures. From Sinai to Scout Troop is a very long way, I admit, but there is a common thread, and that thread is the role of oaths and covenants and promises in life. The word covenant is not a religious word, but we think of it that way. It's actually a legal word. If you're married, you've entered into a legal covenant. You agreed, someone else agreed. You are now bound together by law to care for one another in a responsible way. And you can only get out of it through other legal means. Likewise, there are real estate covenants, and they used to be used terribly to prevent people from selling to black people or to require you not to sell to other people for this reason or that. But the word covenant for most people really is a religious one, and they use it all the time. But I wanted you to know that it's about a legally binding promise. And that's the thing that I notice seems to have changed in the brief time between 1966, when I raised my hand. Actually, it's more like 1964 and 2018. Those things of making promises, it doesn't seem to matter as much, does it? Let's take marriage, for example. That's the covenant many people in this room have undertaken. Now, somewhere between the age of 11 and 23, when I got married, getting married was no longer normative, required, expected. Not being married became okay. Cohabitation became commonplace. I'm not criticizing, just observing. How many couples did you hear, maybe you yourself said, we don't have to get married, it's, quote, just a piece of paper. What does the law have to do with that? I'm just saying that the notion that making a formal promise became less important in a very brief amount of time. You know, when I was a kid, many of you and I are a similar age, we all learned the same thing. It wasn't taught to us directly. You were told you go to school, get a job, get married, have children, buy a house, and in that order. Right? And if you didn't, you were in Dutch, as it were, with somebody or someone or your community. Now it doesn't matter. You can do them in any sequence at all. You can do some of them and not all of them. And so, when a couple comes to me these days to get married, I say, why? You don't need to. You can get everything you want out of marriage without the actual ceremony. After all, you don't have to be married, a woman especially, to have a child and not be in a difficult position. 40% of all children are born without, quote, benefit of clergy. Health insurance, you can get that as a single person. You can get it through a domestic partnership. People buy houses on their own. They even buy them as couples without getting married. And this is all fine. I'm not being critical and judgmental. I'm just observing that something has shifted. And yet people still come to churches to get married. Though it is diminished in its force, the idea of making a public promise still has something about it that's worth noticing. In my research this week, I encountered some words by the Kentucky sage Wendell Berry, who made the following observation. One is married to marriage as well as to one's spouse. Think about that. And to something vital of one's own that does not exist before the marriage, one's given word. Adultery and divorce now must be looked upon as instances of that disease of word breaking, which our age justifies as being realistic, practical, or necessary, but which is tattering the invariably single fabric of speech and trust. What he's saying is that we no longer take each other's word seriously. You can make a promise, but no one expects you to keep it if something more important comes along. It is the decline of that very thing I raised my hand and promised, the decline of a concept called honor. Now, that's a bizarre word to be using right now. Long ago, I read a book called The Homeless Mind by the sociologist Peter Berger, who argued that the world of antiquity that made its way into the 18th and 19th century, the world in which God was in heaven, kings were on top of us, and everything else, that round world of consequence was breaking down, and modernity had done it with its science, with its reason, and that inside of that concept, the idea of honor was essential. Because if you broke a boundary, if you stepped across one of those thresholds that separated you from someone else or something else, you would get social criticism. People would poo-poo at the very least. And that was breaking down under the modern world that's more empirical. So honor is associated with maintaining an antiquated and out-of-date notion of reality. So the question I'm asking is, do we have only these two choices? Honor that defends something that doesn't matter, or hypocrisy as being the inevitable outcome of modernity? Are the only forces in society that matter the legal ones that will land us in jail or in a courtroom, subjecting us to jail or fines? Is there some reason for us to be good and honorable even when the law doesn't require it of us? Must we still keep our promises without a lawyer present or an officer of the law lurking around the corner? I think yes. And I think we're seeing it now because, well, let me put it this way. If anything good can come from our current president, he is proving that we are still outraged by some behaviors, even though they may not be illegal. I say this knowing that government officials have been terrible at this many, many times and over many, many years. The president's actions this week, for example, are less brutal and abusive than Preston Brooks literally beating the life out of Senator Charles Sumner in 1856, but they are just as brutal and bullying and abusive in words. Margaret Hartman writes in this week's New York Magazine, one of the very first Trump campaign scandals involved the candidate mocking Senator John McCain's military service, saying, "He's not a war hero, he's a war hero because he was captured. I like people that weren't captured." And a groan of dismay came up over a year ago. Why do I bring that up? Because just this week, in response to Senator McCain's opinion from his own home in Arizona, because he cannot make it to Washington because he's dying of cancer, someone said we don't have to pay attention to him anymore because he's dying anyway. If you're outraged, it means you feel honor is still consequential. That there are things that do not need the punishment of law to be liable for opprobrium and for criticism. Was it illegal what the aide said? No. Was it dishonorable? Utterly. And we see this again and again in the current administration, a complete disregard for human decency. Remember Joseph Welch? Anyone in this room? At long last, sir, have you no decency? And in 1954, that was enough to bring Senator Joseph McCarthy to the ground. And today, it only causes a momentary headline before the next tweet comes running out. We still have a notion of honor, but we are not willing to defend it. But we still have it. There is hope. Let's turn back to the book of Psalms to find our way out. I told you about Psalm 119, 176 verses. I've heard the story that in very righteous households where a parent would punish a child by making them memorize a portion of the Bible, a very great misstep would result in having to memorize all of Psalm 119. But I told you its theme throughout all 176 verses is remembering the promises you made to God. Because if you memorize those things, they're harder to say you forgot. All that stuff in the Psalms about remembering promises may look like overkill until I look out in the world and see promises being overlooked, forgotten, and turned over day in and day out. It turns out we've been doing this for thousands of years. Does that mean we should go back to the days of chivalry and honor when one could fling a gauntlet on the ground and challenge someone to a duel? No, it doesn't mean that. But it does mean that something is at stake when we fail to make promises and fail to keep them. Actually, in the very end, society itself is being eroded by our unwillingness to be decent, to be honorable to our fellow human beings. A society where one's word can be broken easily, where it can be countermanded on a daily basis, where it's therefore not even taken seriously when it's made, is truly what Wendell Berry called tattering the fabric of speech and trust. I don't care how practical it is or how realistic or how necessary. At some point, we must be as good as our word, or our word means nothing in the first place. And without that, there is no trust. Who would get married if they know we all had our fingers crossed behind our back? Without basic trust, we would not go to a bank because someone would take the money. Without basic trust, we'd hide our food in the cellar so the neighbors wouldn't come and steal it. Without basic trust, we would find chastity belts back in fashion and we'd all sleep with loaded guns beside us. Do you not understand that promises and words and honor still have their value? If I cannot believe what you say, I cannot believe in you at all. And sadly, too often in government, and especially now, we find examples of dishonorable behavior on an almost hourly basis. But I'm not here to rob you of hope. I'm here to help you away from despair. There is hope. It is coming from the stereotypical cavalry. That is to say, coming from unexpected places at the last moment. Guess what? More people are getting married. Yes. And many of them are same-sex couples. Now, you might say, what does that have to do with anything? Well, when the outsider who could not get married demands to be admitted to the practice of making promises, they're reminding us of how far we have fallen. That's often how it happens. When the outcast is better than those who cast them out. When they demand to be let into a society to be able to practice the virtues that they were told they could not practice. This next month we honor Loving Day. Do you remember what that's about? The Loving family, a white man married to a black woman who moved to Virginia and were convicted of miscegenation, took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that you cannot prevent two people from getting married, a male and a female in this case, because of their race. It's wonderful that their name is Loving when you think about it. I underscore that because a member of this church, a young person, produced a wonderful film about it, and we should be very proud not only that it happened, but that we are part of its memory. But outsiders who demand to make the promises that we on the inside will not keep are those who will call us back to our virtue. The Me Too movement. Women are finally saying and demanding that men keep their promises and keep their hands to themselves, and they're being taken seriously. Before they were ignored. Oh, it's just the way things are. No longer. Women are demanding and speaking. They are being honorable and showing the dishonor of men in their honorable behavior. You heard about that caravan of people coming to the border. You heard about it from our president, who made it sound like a whole bunch of criminals were trying to climb over a fence. Do you know the reality? They tried to get in the country legally, one after another, claiming asylum for living in a country where their lives are at risk, and they stood in line day in and day out and still do, following our law. They are not violating our law, they're following our law, and like the black people who sat at lunch counters, they are demonstrating the inhumanity of our law by following it to the letter. They are keeping their promise while we are breaking ours. Our hope as a nation will not come from those who sit in positions of power, but those who deserve the power that has been denied them year in and year out, generation to generation. The hope of America does not come from those who are occupying high office, but those who have been denied their reality by those offices. Our promises, our honor is being demonstrated by those we have denied it to for generations. The moral leaders of society are most often those deemed immoral by its legal leaders. Our hope, therefore, is real in people of color, in women, in LGBTQ folk, in the poor, in the refugee, and those demanding that we live up to our promises as a nation. We should be following them. Next week is the holy day of Christian Pentecost. But this week is the Jewish festival of Pentecost, also called Shavuot. It is the festival that marks the giving of the law, that smoky, fiery, earthquakey thing I told you before. They do it every year. Why? Well, you could think of that moment in antiquity as the moment that a people got married to God. It was a covenant of obligation. And I don't know about you, but whenever my anniversary comes around, I kind of re-enlist, don't you? You say, yeah, I'll go for another year. God bless. I'll try again. I'm up for it again. That's what that holiday is to remind them about. But that's also why school children say the Pledge of Allegiance every day. Even when they don't know what they're pledging allegiance to, they learn the words like I learned the oath. And it gets inside you. I understand they do the same thing in Congress, although I suspect the left hands are behind them with fingers crossed behind their backs. But that's what it takes. Ritual repetition. Looking at your spouse if you are married and say, I'd do it all over again. It's looking at your parents and your children and saying, I'm so glad we have each other. It's looking at your flag and saying, yes, my country, right or wrong, but when she's in the wrong, I should put her right. It is re-upping for the promise. It is holding up yourself to the honorable task of keeping promises and holding others to those same promises. It is, in a word, what I did every Friday night for 6 years. I held up my hand and said, on my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country. Are we prepared to do that in the face of so many who don't? We must. We must be willing to make that promise every day. And only then can we save ourselves and our nation. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be found true in thy sight, thou who art my rock and my Redeemer.